Princess Anne has just been given one of the most significant positions within the entire British royal family. And truthfully, very few people are discussing what this really represents for the monarchy at this moment. Like, on its face, it appears to be some traditional appointment, but when you truly grasp what's unfolding here, the consequences are genuinely enormous. And the reality that it's happened at Camilla's expense is turning this whole scenario far more compelling than anyone anticipated. Here's what's going on. The red box, you understand, iconic container that contains all the classified intelligence reports and state papers that only the monarch is permitted to access. Yes, that somehow wound up in Anne's possession instead of remaining with Camilla. Before you assume that's merely some symbolic gesture, realize that in the vocabulary of the British monarchy, whoever controls the keys to that red box is essentially wielding genuine power. We're not discussing ceremonial matters here. We're discussing who receives classified intelligence, who maintains final authority on legislation, who genuinely controls things when circumstances get difficult. It's the genuine source of constitutional power. And Anne unexpectedly has it. Camilla simply doesn't. King Charles implemented this decision, and it's revealing plenty about how he's approaching his own reign and who he genuinely relies on when matters get critical. Because here's the reality about having a queen consort. Sure, Camilla's wedded to the king. She's constantly beside him at functions. She's technically one of his nearest daily partners. When it involves the genuine operations of governing the country, she got entirely excluded. And that's calculated. It's not an error or some strange omission. This was an intentional decision. So, you need to grasp the background first. King Charles is managing his own health challenges currently, which is clearly creating strain on the whole system. You can't have a monarch who's regularly dealing with medical procedures, also attempting to oversee all the daily governance. Something has to yield. The question becomes, who intervenes to bridge that void? And this is where it gets genuinely intriguing, because the apparent choice theoretically would be Prince William. He's the successor. He's the future king. Naturally, he should be the one managing administrative duties while Charles is recuperating, right? Except William can't handle it. And truthfully, when you consider his genuine life currently, it makes total sense why Catherine is managing her own serious health condition and going through recuperation. William's got 3 young children who require him available and engaged as a father. He's essentially being stretched in every direction, emotionally and practically. And beyond all that, he's already bearing the mental burden of understanding he's going to be king eventually, forcing him to also absorb every single aspect of genuinely governing the monarchy while juggling all of that would simply overwhelm him. It's excessive for one individual, particularly when that individual also has young children and a wife who's healing from something serious. So rather than the successor, Charles turned to his sister. And this is where the brilliant move comes in, because Anne is genuinely ideal for this position in ways that William could never be. At least not currently. First of all, she's merely 2 years younger than Charles. Indicates she experienced the identical historical moments, recognizes all the identical political figures, grasps the precedents, because she was genuinely there when they were created. She doesn't require someone to update her on why particular things matter historically, because she experienced them. That's knowledge you can't fabricate or acquire quickly, and it's tremendously valuable when you're managing a government in turmoil. But the more significant thing is something that honestly most individuals wouldn't even consider. Anne has completely zero royal ambition, and that appears like an unusual thing to commend someone for. But in the framework of royal politics, it's genuinely everything. See, there's this entire structure of male preference primogeniture that existed when Anne and Charles were children, which essentially meant that even though she was born second and Charles was born later, ultimately he advanced ahead of her in the succession line simply because he's male. So Anne got pushed progressively down the line every time a brother was born. That's clearly unjust and antiquated. But here's what's compelling. Genuinely made her the ideal individual to possess power currently, because she has zero route to the throne and no desire in obtaining one regardless. Think about what that signifies politically. When Anne enters a room and accesses that red box, or conveys a message from the king to the prime minister, nobody questions she's doing it to seize more authority for herself. There's no group behind her, no competing faction using her to weaken Charles. She's simply the representative, and everyone understands it. She's entirely dependable because she literally has nothing to acquire personally from controlling the system. She can't become queen even if she attempted, so there's no motivation to manipulate anything to her benefit. The government relies on her, the public relies on her, and most significantly, Charles relies on her entirely. And honestly, reliance didn't simply emerge from nowhere. This wasn't Charles just randomly concluding that his sister should assume this duty. Queen Elizabeth spent decades essentially preparing Anne for precisely this position, even if nobody explicitly identified it that way at the time. Throughout the latter half of the 20th century, whenever the British Commonwealth encountered a genuine crisis or authentic political turbulence, Elizabeth would dispatch Anne in as her delegate. Not for the pleasant ceremonial visits that other royals received, Anne was dispatched to the locations where things were strained and careful negotiation was genuinely required. Elizabeth relied on her daughter with genuine independence and the capacity to make genuine decisions representing the crown when the queen couldn't physically be present. That was fundamentally a decades-long training in how to manage statecraft at the uppermost level. Anne wasn't simply appearing and greeting people. She was doing the genuine work of diplomacy and representation under the most challenging conditions. So, by the time Elizabeth was passing and examining how Charles's reign was going to function, she'd already established all this foundation. She'd already transformed Anne into the ideal individual to intervene whenever the monarchy required someone who could genuinely manage things. And the thing is, Elizabeth implemented this remarkably intelligent constitutional action right before she passed that essentially secured everything into position. In late 2022, when the Queen was nearing the conclusion of her life and contemplating what Charles's reign would genuinely resemble, she arranged this modification to the Regency Acts through Parliament. She included Anne and Edward to the roster of working counselors of state for their lifetimes. Now, this appears like a technical legal matter. It was genuinely brilliant palace strategy because it resolved a substantial problem that nobody was genuinely addressing publicly. The challenge was that the previous roster of individuals who could intervene and implement the monarch's authority was essentially compromised. Harry had withdrawn himself from everything by relocating to California and doing his entire situation. And Andrew had become entirely unusable politically after his own controversies. So you had this circumstance where if something occurred to Charles and he couldn't govern, the individuals technically available to intervene were essentially nobody he genuinely wanted controlling power. Elizabeth corrected that by placing Anne and Edward on there indefinitely. It was legally solid, politically impossible to dispute, and it fundamentally sidelined Harry and Andrew in a manner that was dignified and couldn't be questioned. So, Elizabeth was essentially stating, okay, when my son becomes king and he experiences what kings experience, health challenges, strain, exhaustion, Anne is going to be the individual he can rely on. She's going to be the protection. And because I'm executing this through Parliament and making it official, there's no opportunity for anyone to challenge it or attempt to undermine it subsequently. But before any of that, Anne had already been acquiring these titles and distinctions that were essentially indicating to everyone who paid attention that she was ascending into a different level of significance within the family. In 1987, Elizabeth granted her the title of Princess Royal, which is this historic designation that can only be possessed by one individual at a time and traditionally belongs to the eldest daughter of the ruling monarch. It's not simply a pleasant thing you grant to a family member. It arrives with an implicit expectation that you're going to commit your complete life to service to the crown, separate from whatever political condition the country is experiencing. It's essentially a formal indicator stating this individual is uniquely significant to how we operate as a dynasty. Then in 1996, Anne got invested as a Knight of the Thistle, which is Scotland's supreme order of chivalry. And this is genuinely noteworthy because it wasn't random ceremonial matters. Anne had spent years genuinely doing serious work in Scotland, overseeing complex relationships and charitable matters in the Commonwealth, genuinely getting engaged in the genuine welfare of communities there, instead of simply appearing for photo opportunities. The investment as a knight was essentially the nation stating, okay, we acknowledge you. We recognize that you comprehend this country on a deeper level than simply ceremonial appearances. And then when Charles had his coronation in 2023, he did something genuinely intriguing. He selected Anne to be his gold stick in waiting, which is this historical position that dates back centuries and is traditionally granted to someone the monarch relies on with their personal security and protection. So there's Anne, in complete military uniform, riding on horseback, directly behind Charles's gold state coach through the streets of London during his coronation. That's not simply a callback to tradition. Charles publicly placing his reliance on record in front of the whole nation. He's literally demonstrating everyone that Anne is the one who supports him, the one protecting him and the dynasty. It's tremendously symbolic, and it was an indication that nobody could overlook. What's been compelling is observing how Anne's relationship with her husband Timothy Lawrence has also gotten enhanced right alongside her. Timothy entered into the royal household back in the mid-1980s when he was a young naval officer selected to be an equerry to Queen Elizabeth. He wasn't prominent or pursuing attention. He was simply there, working within the operations that maintained the family functioning, witnessing what it genuinely required to manage all the strain that Anne was bearing. And Elizabeth observed that she recognized how Timothy assisted Anne without ever requiring the attention or requesting recognition, how he simply quietly committed himself to supporting her through an utterly demanding schedule. In 2011, Elizabeth made him a Knight Commander of the Royal Victorian Order, which is essentially the Queen's personal appreciation to someone who served her well and closely. But Charles took it further. Recently, he enhanced Timothy to Knight Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order, which is literally the supreme rank in that whole system. This is Charles's personal honor to Timothy, entirely separate from any government procedure. So it's a direct declaration from the king himself stating, I acknowledge what you've accomplished. I recognize what you represent to Anne, and I'm placing you in this exclusive circle of individuals who are nearest to the throne. It's a remarkable public declaration about how significant Timothy has become to the genuine operation of the monarchy. Now, here's where it gets compelling, because there's genuinely this entire historical dimension underneath all of this that makes the friction with Camilla even more pronounced. Back in the early 1970s, before Camilla was married to Andrew Parker Bowles, and way before she ever became Queen Consort, she was genuinely in a serious relationship with Andrew Parker Bowles when he was with Anne. And Anne and Andrew had this authentic connection based on shared interests. They cherished horses. They were both passionate about equestrian matters. They were powerfully connected honestly. It didn't succeed because of religious matters. Andrew was Catholic, and the Constitution didn't permit for that kind of marriage back then. So they concluded it. But Anne and Andrew remained close friends even after he married Camilla. Then Anne married Mark Phillips, which didn't ultimately succeed. And eventually she ended up with Timothy, who'd been there quietly supporting her the entire time. And that relationship became the stable, grounded partnership that allowed Anne genuinely operate and do the remarkable amount of work she does. She does over 450 engagements a year, which is more than essentially any other working royal. And Timothy simply supports that without requiring anything from it. So when you examine what's occurring now with Camilla being entirely excluded from the red box and all the genuine power while Anne is rising, there's this entire complicated history underneath it. Camilla's married to the king. She's the queen consort, and yet she's being excluded from the genuine mechanics of governance. Meanwhile, Anne, who doesn't possess a crown, has decades of genuine work and a husband who's been quietly supporting her the whole time, is being positioned as the genuine center of institutional authority. The British public has essentially already determined what they think of all this, and the statistics support it. When you examine the recent opinion surveys, Anne consistently ranks at the very top of royal popularity, right alongside Catherine and the memory of Elizabeth. People view her as the most hardworking member of the family, the individual who genuinely appears and does the job without requiring constant validation or media attention. And they're not perceiving her elevation to this Regency-adjacent position as some political strategy or power seizure. View it as fairness. Honestly, it's something that should have occurred already because she's earned it through genuine output and authentic service. Genuinely crystallized this public sentiment was this moment in the BBC documentary about Charles's coronation year. The documentary granted people this remarkably intimate glimpse at what was occurring inside the monarchy during what was essentially its most vulnerable period. And Anne did something in that film that you rarely witness royals do. She was simply truthful about something genuine. She discussed her mother's final days at Balmoral, and she disclosed that Elizabeth had genuinely been concerned about passing there because of the logistical nightmare it would generate for the government and the family. And Anne simply told her mother to disregard that and spend her final days where she desired to be because she deserved that peace. But here's the part that genuinely reached people. Anne discussed witnessing the imperial state crown being removed off Elizabeth's coffin during the funeral. And she described this profound sense of relief she experienced, not because she didn't cherish her mother or wasn't mourning, because she comprehended that her mother's burden had finally concluded. That decades-long weight of duty that Elizabeth carried was finally over. Anne was able to acknowledge that her mother had essentially sacrificed her complete life to the institution. And there was something almost gentle in recognizing that the strain was finally gone. That moment, raw truthfulness from Anne about death and duty and what service genuinely costs, that made the whole nation perceive her differently. It grounded everything in genuine human emotion instead of ceremony. And that documentary moment mattered because it demonstrated people why Anne is the correct individual for this position. She's not someone who's going to pretend everything is acceptable when it isn't. She's not going to conceal behind ceremony or formality. She comprehends that the institution survives by being truthful about what it genuinely costs and who's genuinely doing the work. You can observe how this has unfolded with the younger generation of royals too, particularly William and Catherine. Both of them have made it remarkably clear that they respect Anne enormously and that they genuinely want her to possess this enhanced position. William especially has been vocal about perceiving Anne as an essential protection for the family, someone whose integrity and work ethic is so beyond question that it safeguards everyone around her from constant media examination. He and Catherine have both deliberately yielded the attention to her during major functions, which sends this message to everyone observing that they don't perceive her as competition or a danger. They perceive her as someone who's doing the genuine work and deserves recognition for it. And William clearly comprehends that Anne's enhanced position genuinely helps him currently. It removes some of the strain off him at a moment when he's managing Catherine's recovery and attempting to be available for his children. He doesn't have to attempt to be everywhere doing everything. Anne is managing the heavy administrative lifting, which grants him space to be a father and a husband, and eventually a future king. But not all three at the same time currently. It's genuinely a really intelligent power distribution, and William grasps it. The thing that's become almost impossible to disregard, though, is what this elevation of Anne signifies for Camilla's position. Because while Camilla receives to sit next to Charles at state occasions and occupy the title of Queen Consort, she's fundamentally excluded from genuine power. She doesn't receive the red box. She doesn't receive classified briefings. She doesn't receive to access state documents or authorize things into law. She's essentially a ceremonial presence while the genuine machinery of governance flows around her into Anne's possession. And that's not an accident or an oversight. That's a deliberate declaration about what Charles values and who he relies on with genuine authority. There's also this lingering shadow of Diana that Camilla has spent her whole time in the royal family attempting to navigate. The British public never genuinely forgave her for the role people perceived her playing in Charles and Diana's marriage. And even though decades have passed, and Diana's been gone for years, there's still this weight to it. So now when Camilla's observing Anne get celebrated by the public and enhanced by Charles while she's sidelined from genuine power, it's got to be this crushing realization about her genuine position within the institution. She's married to the king, but she's not relied on with the things that matter. What's genuinely fascinating about where the monarchy is currently is that it's fundamentally altered how it operates. The traditional palace approach was to preserve this illusion that everything was perfect, that the royals were somehow above the struggles that regular people manage. Charles and Catherine have fundamentally thrown that strategy out the window. Charles has been publicly transparent about his health condition and treatment in a manner that previous monarchs never would have been. Catherine's been truthful about her own recovery process, and instead of attempting to conceal or minimize what's occurring, the institution is essentially stating, okay, this is genuine life. These are genuine challenges, and here's how we're managing them. And in that framework, the decision to position Anne as this central administrative figure is genuinely the monarchy being intelligent about its own survival. Charles is stating, I require to share this burden with someone I entirely rely on, and that individual is my sister. He's not pretending he can accomplish everything himself. He's not pretending the institution can operate at full capacity with nobody intervening. He's being practical and truthful about what the condition genuinely requires. The image of Anne standing at the center of all this, prepared to access the red box, authorize laws, guide the state through whatever's coming next. That's become authentically reassuring to people, because whatever else is changing or uncertain about the monarchy currently, Anne is a known quantity. She's going to appear, she's going to do the work, she's not going to seek personal recognition from it. She's going to make decisions based on what's genuinely best for the institution and the country, rather than what benefits her personally. That's rare, and people recognize it. That's why the public response has been so overwhelmingly positive. And that's why this entire transformation of her position, while it might appear subtle from the outside, genuinely represents something really noteworthy about how the monarchy is attempting to evolve and keep itself relevant and functional in an era where the traditional formulas simply don't work anymore.